7:47 p.m. The lights inside the magnificent ballroom had barely begun to dim when Mercy Johnson appeared, and for a few breathtaking seconds, it seemed as though the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. At 41, she moved slowly beside Prince Odianosen Okojie, one hand gently resting over her stomach, while cameras flashed from every direction. In the story now stirring intense excitement among fans, Mercy was said to be expecting a child with the man walking beside her, and on this extraordinary night, surrounded by famous guests and an atmosphere of almost unimaginable luxury, the couple appeared to be stepping into what many were already calling a million-dollar wedding spectacle. Outside, one luxury car after another had rolled toward the entrance. Guests in glittering gowns and perfectly tailored suits crossed a pathway buried beneath fresh flowers. Photographers shouted names. Security moved quietly through the crowd. Inside, crystal lights reflected across polished floors while enormous floral arrangements rose above tables prepared with almost theatrical precision. Everything suggested celebration, wealth, and power. Yet the moment Mercy entered, the extravagance suddenly became background noise. Heads turned toward her. Conversations faded. Prince remained close, matching the careful rhythm of her steps as she moved farther into the hall. According to the story surrounding the event, several guests immediately noticed the tenderness with which he watched her, especially whenever Mercy lowered her eyes toward her stomach. But if the room saw happiness, the imaginary camera saw something more complicated. It moved closer to Mercy's face, beyond the elegant makeup and controlled smile, searching for the emotion she seemed determined not to reveal. For one brief moment, her expression changed. The smile remained, but her eyes appeared distant, as though the noise of the ballroom had suddenly disappeared, and another chapter of her life had returned without warning. Behind every flash of a camera were years that could not simply be erased by diamonds, flowers, or applause. There had been difficult moments, rumors, painful public scrutiny, and memories that, according to those following their story, may have left scars invisible to everyone standing beneath those chandeliers. Perhaps that was why Mercy suddenly tightened her fingers around Prince's hand. He looked toward her. No words were exchanged. He simply moved closer. At 7:52 p.m., the music rose and the guests began applauding, but Mercy remained still for another second. Her hand returned to her stomach. A woman near the front table appeared emotional. Another guest raised a phone to capture the moment. Somewhere behind them, glasses touched in celebration, yet Mercy seemed almost separated from everything happening around her. What had brought Mercy and Prince to this dazzling moment? Why, during a night designed to look like a fairy tale, did she occasionally seem overwhelmed by something deeper than happiness? And what memories could possibly survive beneath the brilliance of what was being described as one of the most extravagant celebrations of the year? Prince gently placed his hand behind Mercy's back, guiding her forward as the crowd opened a path. She took another step, then another. The applause became louder, the cameras flashed faster, and the enormous doors behind them slowly closed. But just before Mercy disappeared into the sea of waiting guests, she stopped, lowered her eyes toward the hand resting over her stomach, and remained completely silent. For several seconds, amid hundreds of people celebrating around her, Mercy Johnson seemed to be standing entirely alone, with a memory no one else in that glittering ballroom could see. Long before the chandeliers of tonight reflected across Mercy Johnson's face, before the flowers covered the entrance, and before hundreds of eyes followed every careful step she took beside Prince Odianosen Okojie, there had been another journey, one far less glamorous, far more private, and impossible to measure in photographs. To millions of viewers, Mercy was the Nollywood star whose face appeared on screens, red carpets, and entertainment pages. But fame rarely stops at the edge of the stage. The brighter the spotlight became, the more closely strangers seemed to examine everything surrounding her. Her appearance, her decisions, her marriage, her family, even moments that were never meant to belong to the public. There were years when a simple photograph could become a conversation, when silence could produce rumors, and when ordinary changes inside a family could be interpreted by people who had never sat at their table or heard the conversations behind their closed doors. For Mercy, the distance between being a public figure and being a wife could sometimes feel painfully small. A demanding schedule might keep her away for hours. Filming could stretch late into the evening. There were reportedly periods when work required constant movement, leaving behind those familiar questions faced by so many working parents. How much time can be given to a career without taking something away from home? How do you remain present for the people you love when thousands of others are constantly demanding another piece of you? Imagine Mercy returning home after a long day, removing the jewelry and makeup associated with the woman audiences recognized, and finally entering a room where none of those things mattered. Behind that door, she was no longer simply Mercy Johnson, the actress. She was a woman carrying responsibilities, exhaustion, expectations, and emotions that cameras could never fully capture. And Prince lived on the other side of that same reality. Being married to a woman known by millions meant accepting that moments belonging to two people could suddenly become discussions among thousands of strangers. A photograph could be analyzed, an absence could be questioned, a facial expression could become a headline, even silence could be interpreted as evidence of something that might never have happened. That kind of attention can create pressure without making a sound. Yet according to the public story of their relationship, Prince remained beside Mercy as different chapters of family life unfolded. That does not mean every day was perfect. No marriage needs to be turned into a fairy tale to make its endurance meaningful. There could have been tired evenings, missed moments, disagreements never heard outside their home, and days when responsibilities pulled them in opposite directions. There could also have been ordinary reconciliations, a conversation after everyone else had gone to sleep, a hand placed quietly on a shoulder, or simply two people sitting together after a difficult day without needing to explain everything. Perhaps that is what makes the dazzling celebration imagined tonight feel heavier than a display of wealth. The expensive cars, famous guests, towering flowers, and brilliant lights may capture attention, but they cannot explain why Mercy sometimes looks as though she is remembering something while everyone else is celebrating. The emotional weight lies somewhere behind the spectacle, in all those unseen years when applause was absent and there were only choices, responsibilities, and the complicated work of sharing a life under public scrutiny. And now the timeline begins moving forward again. Back toward 7:47 p.m. Back toward that enormous ballroom. Back toward Mercy at 41, reportedly carrying another child with Prince, surrounded by guests who have come to celebrate them. But before the doors fully open again, one image remains from those quieter years. A house late at night. The outside world finally silent. Mercy sitting for a moment after another exhausting day while Prince stands nearby. No photographers. No applause. No million-dollar decorations, just two people beneath an ordinary light, surrounded by everything the public could never truly know. And then came the morning that, within this imagined and unverified version of the story, changed the emotional direction of everything. There were no flashing cameras, no famous guests, no music, and no enormous ballroom filled with flowers. There was only the quiet of an ordinary morning, and Mercy Johnson sitting almost motionless, holding a result in her hands. For several seconds, she did nothing. She did not scream. She did not immediately cry. She simply stared at the paper as though her mind needed time to understand what her eyes were seeing. In this hypothetical storyline, Mercy was pregnant with Prince Odianosen Okojie's child. At 41, after years filled with work, family responsibilities, and life under constant public attention, another chapter appeared to be opening when neither of them had expected the emotional force with which it would arrive. Mercy slowly lowered the paper. Her fingers moved toward her stomach almost instinctively. Nothing could yet be seen from the outside, but suddenly that simple gesture carried an entirely different meaning. Then Prince entered the room. At first, he looked at Mercy. Then he noticed the paper in her hand. His expression changed. He stepped closer, but there were no dramatic words between them. Mercy looked up at him. Prince looked down at the result. And for a few long seconds, silence filled the room. It was the kind of silence that can feel louder than celebration because both people understand that something has changed before either one knows exactly what to say. Then Mercy placed her hand over her stomach again. Prince moved closer and wrapped his arms around her. Only then did the tension begin to break. A small smile appeared. Perhaps there were tears. Perhaps there was nervous laughter. But beneath the happiness was another emotion that neither could ignore: uncertainty. Because joy does not erase responsibility. If this unconfirmed pregnancy were real within the story, it would mean rearranging plans, schedules, and priorities around a new life. Mercy was no longer the young actress standing at the beginning of her career. She was 41, with an established public life and a family already carrying its own routines and responsibilities. Prince, too, would understand that welcoming another child was not simply about celebrating an announcement. It meant beginning again in countless small ways. Suddenly, calendars mattered differently. Work commitments had to be reconsidered. Trips that once seemed simple required another thought. Even ordinary conversations about the months ahead carried new weight. And yet, somewhere inside that uncertainty, excitement continued growing. Mercy reportedly began imagining not the headlines that might eventually surround such news, but the smallest possible moments. Another place at the family table, another voice inside the house, another tiny hand reaching toward hers. For Prince, the imagined future may have appeared in equally ordinary images. A child asleep against his chest, another birthday, another photograph added to the family collection. Nothing extravagant, nothing designed for an audience. Just life changing quietly from the inside. And perhaps that was when the idea of celebration began to mean something different. In this fictionalized narrative, plans that had once seemed fixed started moving. Conversations became longer. What had originally been another chapter in an already busy life gradually began taking the shape of a symbolic new beginning. The possibility of a grand wedding celebration was no longer simply about luxury or appearances. It became tied to the feeling that their family was entering another season together. Weeks later, as preparations accelerated, fabrics were selected, flowers discussed, guest lists considered, and arrangements changed repeatedly. Mercy would occasionally stop in the middle of everything and place a hand over her stomach. The people around her might continue talking, but for a moment she would hear almost none of it. Because behind every spectacular detail being prepared for that night was one private morning that the outside world had never witnessed. And as the imagined timeline moves closer to 7:47 p.m., one image remains. Mercy, standing alone before a mirror, one hand resting against her stomach, while on the table behind her, an unopened envelope containing the plans for the grand celebration waits silently beneath the morning light. We are going to turn that night into a memory no one will ever forget. In this fictionalized version of Mercy Johnson and Prince Odianosen Okojie's story, those words seem to become the invisible signal that sent everything into motion. Suddenly, there was no more quiet morning, no more time to sit with uncertainty. The countdown had begun. The venue started changing almost hour by hour. Thousands of flowers were imagined arriving in enormous boxes, carried through service entrances while decorators rushed between towering arrangements and unfinished tables. Lighting technicians tested the ballroom once, then again, then a third time because one section appeared too bright. Chairs were measured against the tables. Glasses were repositioned by centimeters. Napkins were folded, unfolded, and replaced. Somewhere down a long corridor, someone was speaking urgently into a phone because an important delivery had not arrived on schedule. Another member of the staff hurried past carrying a garment bag. A door opened. Another closed. The celebration that people would dramatically describe as a $1 million wedding was taking shape, not as a verified price tag, but as the cinematic image of an event designed to look almost impossibly grand. And at the center of that storm was Mercy. During one fitting, she stepped into the wedding dress and stood before a mirror while several people adjusted the fabric around her. For a moment, everyone spoke at once. One person discussed the length. Another examined the details near the waist. Someone else mentioned timing. Then Mercy became completely still. She looked at her reflection, but her eyes seemed to travel beyond it. In this hypothetical storyline, her pregnancy remained a deeply personal part of everything happening around her. Her hands slowly moved toward her stomach. The room continued buzzing behind her, yet she appeared to hear only her own thoughts. At 41, this was not simply about wearing a beautiful dress beneath expensive lights. It was about standing at the intersection of everything that had already happened and everything that might now be changing. Prince was dealing with a different kind of pressure. He checked his watch. He spoke briefly with organizers. He walked through the ballroom, stopped beside the main table, then asked for one chair to be moved. It seemed insignificant among thousands of flowers and elaborate decorations. But that single chair mattered because someone important to the family was supposed to sit there. That was the strange contradiction of the entire preparation. The larger the spectacle became, the more Mercy and Prince appeared to focus on tiny things. Where would their loved ones sit? Would everyone feel included? Would they have even one quiet minute together before hundreds of people surrounded them? A late phone call suddenly interrupted another planning session. For several seconds, faces became tense. Staff members crossed the hallway faster. Prince glanced toward the entrance. Mercy watched him without speaking. Then the problem was apparently resolved, and movement resumed almost instantly. Flowers continued arriving. Lights were tested again. The guest list changed, then changed once more. Names associated with entertainment and public life were reportedly being discussed for the imagined celebration, increasing anticipation around an event already beginning to feel larger than the couple themselves. But Mercy seemed increasingly aware of something the decorations could never provide. Grandeur could impress a room, but it could not create intimacy. Cameras could preserve an image, but they could not preserve exactly how a hand felt inside another hand. So while people around her discussed entrances, lighting, and timing, Mercy asked about family seating. She checked small details others might have ignored. And whenever Prince came close enough, she reached for his hand almost automatically. Outside, everything was becoming more spectacular. Inside, the emotions seemed more fragile. Then the final hours approached. The ballroom was nearly ready. The last flowers were placed. One chair was moved for the final time. Prince stood alone near the center of the enormous room and checked his watch again. Down the corridor, Mercy faced the mirror in her wedding dress. Someone behind her whispered that it was almost time. Mercy did not turn immediately. She lowered her eyes, placed one hand gently over her stomach, and with the distant sound of hurried footsteps approaching the door, she remained completely still. 7:47 p.m. And suddenly, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The music rose through the ballroom, conversations disappeared almost instantly, and the enormous doors at the far end of the hall slowly began to open. For a second, all that could be seen was light spilling through the entrance. Then Mercy Johnson appeared. In this fictionalized, unverified wedding scenario, she stood beneath that light in a magnificent wedding gown, surrounded by flowers, cameras, and an atmosphere so extravagant that the night had already begun to earn its cinematic description as a $1 million wedding. One by one, the guests rose from their seats. Phones were lifted. Cameras flashed. Faces associated with entertainment and public life could be imagined among the crowd, but none of them mattered in that instant because every eye had turned toward the same woman. Mercy took her first step, then another, slowly, carefully. The camera seemed to travel across the room before returning to her. thousands of flowers framing the aisle, crystal decorations reflecting the lights, perfectly arranged tables, glasses catching tiny flashes of gold, and guests standing shoulder to shoulder beneath enormous chandeliers. Everything had been prepared to overwhelm the senses, yet the most powerful image required none of it. At the opposite end of the aisle stood Prince Odianosen Okojie. Only minutes earlier, he had been checking his watch, speaking with organizers and watching people move chairs and make final adjustments. Now he appeared to notice nothing around him. His eyes were fixed entirely on Mercy. She continued forward, one measured step at a time. Then, almost instinctively, her hand moved gently toward her stomach. Within this imagined storyline, where Mercy is said to be expecting their child, that tiny movement seemed to transform the entire scene. This was no longer simply a bride walking toward her husband. It became the image of a woman carrying the possibility of a new chapter while walking toward the man who had shared so many earlier chapters with her. Prince swallowed hard. His lips appeared to tremble slightly. Mercy looked directly at him and blinked several times, as though refusing to allow the tears gathering in her eyes to fall before she reached him. Somewhere among the guests, a relative lowered their head and quietly wiped away tears. The music continued, but for Mercy and Prince, the room seemed to become strangely silent. Perhaps the crowd saw MercyJohnson, the Nollywood star. Perhaps they saw the dress, the lights, the extraordinary decorations, and the spectacle surrounding her. Prince, however, seemed to be looking at something entirely different. He was looking at the woman who had returned home exhausted after long days. The woman who had experienced years of public attention and private responsibilities. The woman with whom he had shared ordinary mornings that would never appear in photographs. The woman who, in this fictionalized story, had once sat silently holding a result that changed every plan they thought they understood. Another step. Mercy was closer now. Prince did not look toward the cameras. He did not turn toward the guests. He simply waited. And perhaps that was the most striking contradiction of the entire night. Millions could be imagined watching the spectacle, yet the emotional center of the room had narrowed to only two people. Mercy finally reached him. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Prince extended his hand. Mercy placed hers inside it. His fingers closed gently around hers, and the expression she had been controlling since entering the ballroom finally softened. She smiled. Not the wide smile expected by photographers, but something smaller, almost private. Prince leaned slightly toward her. No dramatic declaration was needed. Their eyes seemed to carry the conversation. Behind them, flowers climbed toward the ceiling. Around them, the guests remained standing. The lights shimmered across the hall as the ceremony moved forward, and applause eventually erupted through the room. But Mercy appeared overwhelmed. She lowered her eyes again, touched her stomach, then tightened her other hand around Prince's fingers. He noticed immediately. His expression changed, becoming softer. For just a moment, the spectacle disappeared. No luxury cars, no cameras, no famous faces, no talk of an extravagant wedding. Only Mercy and Prince standing side by side while the room around them celebrated something it could see, and the couple seemed quietly aware of something only they could fully feel. Then Mercy raised her eyes toward him once more. Prince smiled, but his eyes were wet, and as another wave of applause filled the ballroom, a single tear finally escaped Mercy's eye and moved slowly down her cheek, while her hand remained resting over her stomach. And then, almost imperceptibly, the applause began to fade. The music softened. Guests slowly returned to their seats, phones were lowered, and the enormous ballroom that only moments earlier had seemed to explode with light and emotion suddenly felt smaller. MercyJohnson and Prince Odianosen Okojie remained standing beside each other at the center of it all. In this fictionalized wedding story, congratulations came from every direction. Smiles surrounded them. Hands reached forward. Cameras continued capturing the scene, yet something had changed. The spectacle was no longer the most important thing in the room. Perhaps after everything, they understood that a marriage could never be held together by one extravagant night. Flowers would eventually fade. The lights would eventually be switched off. The music would stop. The guests would return home. Dresses would be carefully packed away, tables cleared, photographs stored and replayed until even the brightest images became memories. What remained was something much quieter. The way two people looked at each other when no camera was pointed toward them. Mercy turned toward Prince. For several seconds, she simply watched him. Behind that look, the imagined story seemed to carry the weight of years, the exhausting schedules, the nights when work ended later than expected, the pressure of living beneath public attention, the rumors that could grow from silence, and the countless moments when private life risked becoming public entertainment. Not every difficult season needed to involve betrayal or dramatic confrontation. Sometimes loss arrived more quietly. Lost time, missed conversations, celebrations interrupted by work, ordinary evenings sacrificed to responsibilities. Sometimes the hardest pressure was simply waking up and continuing, while strangers believed they understood a life they had only observed from a distance. Prince had lived beside that attention too. Standing next to a famous woman meant learning that even an ordinary expression could be interpreted, that absence could become speculation, and that a private disagreement, if ever exposed, could stop belonging to the two people actually experiencing it. Perhaps there had been moments when both wanted silence but could not find it. Perhaps there had been evenings when exhaustion made conversation difficult. The truth of those private moments belongs to them, not to the audience. But within this imagined narrative, those possibilities make the scene before us more human. Because tonight, Mercy was not smiling as though pain had never existed. She was smiling like someone who understood that happiness does not erase everything that came before it. In this hypothetical storyline, even the possibility of another child had changed the emotional meaning of the night. Her hand occasionally returned to her stomach, almost unconsciously, as though reminding herself that amid all the noise, something deeply personal was unfolding quietly. Then came a moment so small that many guests might not even have noticed it. Mercy prepared to step down from the slightly raised platform. Prince immediately turned toward her. He extended one hand and placed the other carefully near her arm, steadying her as she descended. Mercy looked down, took the step, then looked back at him. That was all. No dramatic speech, no rehearsed declaration, no explosion of music, just one person making sure the other did not stumble. And somehow that simple gesture carried more emotional weight than the chandeliers, the flowers, and every luxurious detail surrounding them. Because love, if it survives beyond celebration, is often revealed in precisely those moments nobody plans. A hand offered before it is requested. A chair moved closer. A glance across a crowded room. The instinct to notice when the person beside you needs support. Mercy reached the floor and did not immediately release Prince's hand. Around them, conversations resumed and glasses were raised again, but the imagined camera stayed close. Prince said something quietly that could not be heard above the room. Mercy smiled, lowered her eyes, and squeezed his fingers. Then they began walking toward their families together. Behind them, the stage remained brilliantly illuminated. Ahead of them waited more congratulations, photographs, and celebration. But halfway across the ballroom, Mercy slowed for a moment. Prince slowed with her without asking why. And while hundreds of lights continued shining above them, neither seemed to notice that the applause had completely stopped. By 10:30 p.m., the night that had seemed almost too bright to end was finally beginning to grow quiet. The music had softened until it was little more than a distant melody, and the guests who had filled the ballroom with laughter, applause, and conversation were slowly preparing to leave. Outside the entrance, luxury cars pulled away one after another, their headlights briefly illuminating the gates before disappearing into the darkness. Inside, the transformation was even more noticeable. Staff members moved quietly between the tables, collecting glasses that only an hour earlier had been raised in celebration. Half-finished drinks remained beside folded napkins. A few flower petals had fallen onto the polished floor. Chairs were no longer perfectly aligned. The grand celebration that had been described in this fictionalized story as a wedding of the century was already becoming something that existed mostly in photographs and memory. Mercy Johnson had stepped away from the center of the ballroom. Behind the stage, away from the remaining cameras and conversations, she had changed into a more comfortable pair of shoes and lowered herself onto a chair. For the first time that evening, she seemed able to sit without hundreds of people watching her. She leaned back slightly and released a long breath. There was no need to perform happiness here. No need to position herself for another photograph. No need to smile because someone had called her name from across the room. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then Prince appeared. He walked toward her without urgency, no longer checking his watch, no longer speaking to organizers or greeting guests. He simply came to the chair beside Mercy and sat down. Neither spoke immediately. After a night filled with words, congratulations, and noise, perhaps silence was exactly what they needed. Mercy looked toward him, then lowered her eyes. Within this imagined and unverified storyline, her hand slowly moved toward her stomach, the same gesture that had appeared again and again throughout the evening. But this time, there were almost no witnesses. Prince followed her movement with his eyes. Then he placed his own hand gently over hers. And suddenly, everything outside that small space seemed impossibly distant. The flowers, the chandeliers, the expensive decorations, the photographers, the famous faces among the guests, all of it had belonged to the celebration. This belonged only to them. If the pregnancy at the heart of this fictional narrative were real, the unborn child would know nothing about the extraordinary night unfolding outside. The child would not know that people had stood when Mercy entered the ballroom. It would not know about the cameras flashing, the elaborate tables, the thousands of flowers, or the applause that had once filled the hall. It would know none of the words people might use to describe the celebration. Luxurious, spectacular, unforgettable, even $1,000,000. And perhaps that was precisely why this quiet moment carried such weight. Because the story had begun not with the wedding, but with the possibility of a child, with a silent morning, with Mercy holding a result in her hands, with Prince looking at her and understanding, before either of them spoke, that their plans might be changing. Now, hours after the grandest moment of the night, the story had returned to exactly the same place. Mercy's hand resting over her stomach and Prince's hand resting gently over hers. Outside the room, another car disappeared beyond the gate. Inside, a staff member carried away the final glasses from one of the tables. Somewhere nearby, a flower arrangement was being dismantled piece by piece. Mercy leaned slightly toward Prince. He moved closer and their shoulders touched. They did not need to say anything. The imagined camera no longer searched for spectacle. It stayed on their hands. Two hands resting together over the possibility of a new life. Beyond the curtain, the ballroom continued emptying. Another light was switched off, then another. Mercy remained seated beside Prince, listening to the distant sounds of a celebration ending, while beneath their joined hands, the unborn child at the center of this imagined story remained untouched by the noise of the night. It was almost midnight. The ballroom that only a few hours earlier had glowed beneath thousands of lights was nearly empty now. The music had stopped. The applause was gone. Most of the guests had already disappeared beyond the entrance, and the long rows of tables stood quietly beneath the fading light. Bouquets of flowers remained exactly where they had been placed, still beautiful, but no longer surrounded by people admiring them. On one table, a single glass had not yet been collected. A folded napkin rested beside it. Several chairs had been pushed away from their original positions, and near the back of the stage, the chair where Mercy Johnson had been sitting only minutes earlier was empty. Nothing dramatic happened. No announcement interrupted the silence. No final speech was made. There was only the soft sound of staff moving through the hall, collecting what remained of a night that had once seemed enormous. Somewhere in the corridor, footsteps echoed and gradually became more distant. At the far end of the ballroom, Mercy and Prince appeared side by side. They were no longer standing beneath the brightest lights. No crowd surrounded them now. No hundreds of eyes followed their movements. They simply walked together toward the final doorway. Prince stayed close to Mercy, gently placing one hand behind her back as they crossed the nearly empty hall. Their pace was slow. Mercy said nothing. Prince said nothing. They passed the tables where guests had laughed only hours earlier. They passed the flowers that had framed their entrance. They passed the place where cameras had flashed again and again when Mercy first walked into the room. Then, only a few steps from the door, Mercy stopped. Prince stopped beside her. For a moment, she turned around. The vast ballroom stretched behind them, almost unrecognizable in its silence. This was the same room where, at 7:47 p.m., every face had turned toward her. The same floor she had crossed slowly in her wedding dress. The same space where Prince had waited without taking his eyes from her. Now there were no raised phones, no applause, and no voices calling their names. Only empty chairs, abandoned tables, and flowers beneath dimming chandeliers. Mercy remained there for another second. Then, within this fictionalized and unverified storyline, her eyes lowered toward her stomach. Her hand followed. A very small smile appeared on her face, not for a camera, not for the remaining staff, not for anyone waiting to photograph the moment. Prince looked at her but did not interrupt the silence. Mercy raised her eyes again, and the two continued walking. Behind them, a member of staff reached toward the lighting controls. One row of lights went dark, then another. The enormous chandeliers that had made the room glitter throughout the evening slowly disappeared into shadow. Mercy and Prince reached the doorway. Prince's hand remained gently behind her back as they crossed through it together. The door began to close, slowly, quietly, until only a narrow line of light remained between the two sides. Then that line disappeared. The camera did not follow them. It stayed inside the ballroom. Another row of lights went out. Then another. The flowers became silhouettes. The empty chair behind the stage vanished into darkness. The forgotten glass on the table caught the light for one final second before that corner of the room went dark as well. Finally, only one small light remained, falling across several white petals scattered in the middle of the ballroom floor. Nothing moved there. Outside the closed door, Mercy and Prince's footsteps could still be heard faintly in the corridor. One step, then another, softer now, farther away. The camera remained fixed on those white petals. The footsteps grew quieter still, and then they disappeared.